Instead, we have the opportunity to make a habit of empathy, to recognize ourselves in each other.
Hi, it's Edwin Rutsch from the Center for Building a Culture of Empathy. I'm here with Roman Krznaric, and so thank you for joining me, Roman.
Great to be here, Edwin. Thank you.
And just as an introduction, Roman, I'm actually on your website here at romankrznaric.com, and it says that you're a cultural thinker and founding member of the School of Life in London, and that you advise Oxfam and the United Nations on using empathy for social change. Would you like to say more about yourself, Roman? Just introduce yourself. Anything else that you'd like to say?
Well, I think for about the last 10 years, I've been very interested in the role that empathy can play both in our pursuit of the art of living as individuals, but also about how it can bring about fundamental change in society. So my interests have always been in where these two sides of the empathic journey or the empathic struggle have been going. And as you mentioned, I'm involved with an organization called the School of Life in London. It was founded by myself and some other thinkers and writers, such as the philosopher Alain de Botton. And the aim of the School of Life is to try and draw on the knowledge that human beings have developed in areas from psychology, philosophy, history, and other realms, and apply them to everyday living. And one of those areas I'm very interested in is empathy, because if you go to a college or a university to study, well, you can't really go and do a degree in empathy. School children are starting to be taught empathy, of course, but it's not really quite yet in the mainstream. So I've been trying to introduce it more into everyday thinking here in Britain through my work at the School of Life, through my work with Oxfam, trying to get them to see that campaigning on issues such as climate change or poverty alleviation has to be seen through the lens of empathy, through the art of stepping into the shoes of other people and seeing how they view the world.
Yeah, so you've been writing about empathy for several years, and I'm actually on your website, and you have whole series of blogs. There's a video clip here. I'm showing. Let me show that on the screen, actually. And there's a video clip of you. What is that video clip? It's like a definition. Was that for the wiki definitions or?
It's actually for an online encyclopedia called
Oh,
Wordia,
okay.
where various experts and so on they give a little 1 minute definition of a key concept, and this one is on empathy.
And you have a whole series. I'm just scrolling down, kind of showing this on the screen. All the articles you've written about education, about empathy with the enemy. And so you've been working at this for quite a while, and I understand you have a new book out called The Wonder Box, Curious
That's
History, and
right.
there's a chapter on empathy as well.
That's right. The Wonder Box is a book about how to live. The subtitle is Curious Histories of How to Live. And normally when you go into a bookshop and you are looking for something to deal with your family dilemmas or dilemmas of love or how to find fulfilling work, the kinds of books you normally find are based on religion or religious thought, sometimes psychology. They're very rarely about history. And The Wonder Box is a book about what gazing into the past, rather than gazing at our own navels, can teach us about life. And it seems to me that looking at empathy, and particularly the history of empathy, is something that we haven't really tapped into, and something that we should if we're serious about pursuing the good life and living an adventurous life.
So there's a quote here I see from you. It's empathy can change society and can bring about a revolution of human relationships. And that's really what I wanted to talk about, is how do we go about building a culture of empathy and kind of frame our discussions about what can we actually do to create a society that raises the level of empathy within society. What kind of thoughts do you have about that?
Well, one of the places I start when I'm thinking about this is about how we as individuals can expand our empathic imaginations. What can we do to change ourselves? And one of the people I like to think about is the early 20th century writer George Orwell, who's best known for books like 1984 and Animal Farm. But actually, I believe he was one of the great empathic adventurers of the 20th century, who has an enormous amount to teach us about changing our empathic selves and building a culture of empathy. In the late 1920s, early 1930s, he famously went onto the streets of East London dressed up as a tramp, as a beggar, and he spent sometimes a few days, sometimes weeks at a time in a shabby coat and shabby shoes, finding out what it was like to live on the social margins in the poorest parts of London. He wrote about this famously in his book Down and Out in Paris and London. And of course, one has to remember that Orwell was from a rather privileged background. He went to the most exclusive high school in Britain. He went to Eton. He was in the colonial police force in Burma. And he really realized that he didn't really know much about how the other half lived, how those on the social margins lived. And what he discovered by going onto the streets of East London was that he was totally wrong. He was very prejudiced, he realized, about people who were living in poverty, who were beggars and so on. And this empathic adventure of being on the streets totally transformed him as a person. It changed his moral universe for a start. It connected him to people who he never really had connected with before. He had much more compassion for those who were living down and out. But it did more than that. It expanded his curiosity about strangers. It gave him great ideas for his literary work as well. He realized that empathy was something that not only made you good, but that it was good for you. It was something that could expand your own life. And so I think there's something very important to learn from Orwell, which is that experiencing other people's lives, how they live, is one of the greatest ways to change our empathic selves. That visceral experience of having someone else's life written on your skin in some way is extraordinarily powerful.
So there's some good factors, good effect on ourselves for empathy. It's not just like you're doing something good for someone else. You're having a really positive effect on yourself.
Well, I think there's both sides. Some people can be motivated simply by that idea of that compassion for strangers. I want to do something which is expanding my ethical world and ethical universe, and that is obviously important. There are also people, and I think it's also important to see that empathy is something that can expand your life in unexpected ways. There are wonderful benefits to it. Partly it comes from that human bond that you get by connecting with strangers or people who you may not have connected with in the past. Perhaps you haven't spoken to your sister for 10 years and you make that empathic leap of trying to make that connection with her and seeing the world through her eyes. That makes you a more ethically sensitive person, but it also can improve the quality of your own relationships. If you want to stop the huge amount of divorce in Western society, 50% of people who get married today get divorced, well, expand the teaching of empathy and knowledge of how to bridge empathic divides by seeing how your partner is experiencing bringing up toddlers while you're out all day. Those things are about social change, but they're also about shifting the contours of your own life. And I think we should embrace those positive aspects of empathy. I think for too long, empathy has been seen simply in that realm of ethics, but it's also in the realm of the art of living, and it's also in the realm of radical social change.
You talked about George Orwell actually going out and kind of doing role plays in a sense. He's taking on the role of a street person. And I think I'd read an article by you as well. There was a woman who's a designer who had also done something like that in terms of taking on the role of an older person. Do you recall that story? And then seeing what it's like?
The person you're talking about there is an extraordinary American designer called Patricia Moore. And she was, in a way, a modern version of George Orwell, exactly as you've picked up on. Now, her story is fantastic. In the 1970s, she was working as a product designer, industrial designer for a famous New York firm called Raymond Loewy. They're the people who designed the Coca-Cola bottle and the Shell logo. She was in a meeting with some of the top executives, and they were talking about the design of something as mundane as a fridge. They were talking about the design of something as mundane as a refrigerator door. And Patricia Moore said to these top partners in the Raymond Loewy firm, couldn't we design those doors so they could be opened by elderly people, people with arthritis? And one of the partners said to her, Patty, we don't design for those people. And this really upset her. This really got to her. So she decided to challenge this idea that the elderly people or people with arthritis shouldn't be included in the concept of design by conducting an extraordinary experiment. What she did between 1979 and 1982 is she dressed up as an 80-year-old. She put makeup on, had a professional makeup artist to make her look in her 80s. She put on a wig. She put on thick glasses on her eyes so she couldn't see properly. She wrapped herself in bandages so she was bent over like an old woman. She wore uneven shoes so that she could experience what it was like being in her 80s. And then what she did is she ventured out into over 100 US cities to find out what it was like to try and negotiate the urban landscape as an elderly woman, to go in and out of the subway station, up and down escalators, into shop doors. And what she found out was that the world was not designed for people who were in their 80s or elderly people. And she ended up becoming an extremely important person in the history of design by coming up with innovations, the idea of what's called universal design. That's the idea that everything should be designed for everybody. One of her most famous inventions is what was called the OXO Good Grip. You might know if you pick up a tin opener, those ones with those thick handles that anybody can hold was invented by Patty Moore, so that someone with arthritis could do something as simple as opening a can, opening a tin. And since then, she's gone on to be a great innovator in designing hospitals and rehabilitation centers for war veterans from Iraq and Afghanistan. And she is, I think, one of the most exciting designers in the world today. And she is an empathy designer. She is the leading figure in empathy design. And it all came through those experiences of trying to be someone other than she is.
So what you're really talking about there is about, it seems like perspective taking. It's like putting yourself into someone else's perspective, actually in a physical sort of a way. And I know I've been seeing there's something called the, it's like I can't remember what they call it. There's a suit for being pregnant, knowing what it's like to be pregnant. So you can put on this suit, and so the husband, right? I can't remember the name of this suit, but so you can actually put on this suit, and it adds all these pounds and all that, and so that's kind of like one way of actually physically, kind of getting as close to the perspective as another. So that's kind of.
Yes,
Oh, go ahead.
I was going to say, yes, I've seen those pregnancy bellies, I think they might be called, online. But of course, it is quite difficult to have these experiences of other people. We can do it, but it's difficult, for example, to emulate what George Orwell did. You could go and sleep on the streets one night and experience a bit of what it's like to be homeless, but that has a danger of becoming voyeuristic. You're not really necessarily experiencing what that is like. And that's something that we can have those kind of experiences. I mean, I, for example, once spent several months living in the Guatemalan jungle in a refugee community. And although I wasn't experiencing exactly what it was like to be an indigenous Mayan refugee in Guatemala, I got a bit of a touch of their life because I was living in a hut with no water, with no electricity. I was having to spend hours each day just to make food, to go to the toilet in a hole in the ground. And a bit of that was rubbing off on me, a bit of that experience. And I think that's the kind of thing that you can do if you're a Peace Corps volunteer, or you can go traveling in developing countries. But of course, it's a bit hard to simulate in everyday life. And that's why we need other routes to the empathic, imaginative expansion. So apart from experience, I think the other very key route is nurturing and practicing the art of conversation, talking to people who see the world very differently from you, who come from very different backgrounds, whose experiences of life are not your own experiences, and trying to bridge that gap between human beings by stepping into the mind of somebody else through a dialogue which creates mutual understanding.
Do you have some examples of how you've gone about doing that personally?
Yes, I mean, for me personally, the great memory in my life was several years ago when I was working for a project here in Oxford in England called the Oxford Muse, spelled M-U-S-E, the Oxford Muse. And the Oxford Muse was invented to create conversations between strangers. And as in part of one of my community projects I was doing there, I arranged to have a conversation with a man who was a paranoid schizophrenic with a history of violence. He'd been locked up many times for being, medically insane. Now, this person was someone I had seen on the local streets where I lived. He'd lived for many years as a street person. And I sat down and had a conversation with him. And in the beginning, I could hardly even understand what he was saying. I thought we had very little in common because he was talking about all the voices that he heard and that he could see children in outer space and things which were really beyond my view of the world. But gradually, I discovered that we had a shared interest in philosophy. It turned out that this man, his name was Alan Human, still is Alan Human, had studied philosophy at the University of Oxford, just down the street from where I live. He had a scintillating and brilliant mind, and he was not just this incomprehensible schizophrenic street sleeper that I'd assumed him to be. And that really challenged my prejudices, that conversation with him. I realized that he and I were not so different. The problem was that I had a lot of assumptions about him. And I think all of us have these assumptions. We label people, whether we label people as paranoid schizophrenics or Muslim extremists or single mothers or even greedy bankers. And we're not seeing the uniqueness of individuals. We're not seeing the real human beings. We're not able to connect with their lives because the barriers of our prejudice and of those labels are so strong. So I think the challenge of empathy in the 21st century, the challenge of conversational empathy, is to start having conversations with strangers. Have a conversation with a stranger once a week. Maybe you'll meet someone like Alan Human who will blow your mind, blow apart your prejudices, and also help you find a new friend.
What I'm going to do is you're seeing a video of me, but I think the video's a little not smooth, so I'm going to stop streaming to you, if that's okay. You won't be able to see me, but I'll be able to see you. I'm just going to hope that the video's a little smoother. So, okay. Yeah, actually, something I did is I traveled for 10 years after graduating from what we call high school here in the United States. And I might mention you're in the UK. And that's actually something I did, was have those type of conversations with lots of people all over the world. And I think that was something that really led to a sense of growth and for myself, and really changed me a lot. So it sounds like what you're talking about is really about judgments, suspending our judgments and prejudices. So I'm kind of like wondering, it's like that's really hard to do, to kind of suspend those judgments. And how do you really go about doing that,
It's very difficult to do that because I think one can't try and treat it as an artificial exercise. You can't go into a conversation with a stranger and say, right, I'm not going to be prejudiced, I'm not going to make any assumptions about them, because that can often lead to a stilted kind of conversation. I think what one needs to do is to treat conversation with strangers as an adventure, to try and recognize that learning how other people see the world is something that can shift your own life. It can change the way you see yourself and other people. And I think one needs to therefore become a little bit unconscious when you're having these kinds of conversations and really just become curious, have the curiosity of a child to understand, how does this person think about politics or love or religion or education? And equally, what's important is to be willing to share part of yourself, to not treat these conversations as an interview, but to treat these conversations as a possibility or for a moment of human connection. That I think that every conversation with a stranger is the possibility of creating mutual understanding and bridging social divides. Now, another way one can do this is in slightly more organized settings. I mean, one of my favorite examples of a project which tries to create conversations across social divides, these empathic conversations, is known as the Parents' Circle, or sometimes called the Bereaved Families Forum, which is based in Israel. I mean, would you like me to tell you a little bit about that? Now, the Parents' Circle is a wonderful organization. It's a grassroots social and political movement in Israel and the Palestinian territories. And the idea behind it is very simple. It brings together families who have lost family members in the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. So there may be a Palestinian family whose son was killed by an Israeli sniper. There may be an Israeli family whose daughter was blown up by a Palestinian suicide bomber. And the Parents' Circle has projects which bring together these Israelis and Palestinians. And sometimes the projects are simple as picnics and other kinds of meetings and conferences where these people from these two different sides get to talk to each other. And often these Israelis have never shaken hands or embraced a Palestinian and vice versa. And what they discover is that they have something in common. They've shared the same blood and the same pain through the loss of their children or loved ones. And they've done a number of other remarkable projects. One of my favorite ones is a blood-giving project where the Israelis went to Ramallah and gave blood in a Palestinian hospital, and the Palestinians went to Jerusalem and gave blood to the Israeli Red Cross. A real mixing of pain and blood. Another great project they have is called Hello Peace, Shalom Peace, where if you're an Israeli, you can pick up the phone and dial a free phone telephone number, and you're immediately put through to a Palestinian with whom you can have a conversation about anything. Equally, if you're a Palestinian, you can pick up and dial this free phone number and have a conversation with an Israeli. Since that project started in around 2002, there have been over 1 million calls logged on that. And now that is a project which is really using conversation to create empathic bonds in an extraordinary way that I think we can all learn from.
So what I'm hearing there is that we can socially, we can create social structures that bring people together for dialogue and kind of be
That's
conscious
right.
about it. That's something I've been seeing, for example, here in the United States. We have these town halls, which, politicians come and they kind of talk to the crowd, right? And it's like a question and answer. So that's like a social structure. One thing I've kind of imagined is actually change that structure so it's like small table discussions, small groups talking to each other instead of kind of being talked at by kind of the expert. So that's really about changing the way that the society is structured to kind of nurture and foster and deepen empathy.
That's right. I think that we can invent all sorts of interesting projects. As you're saying, the idea of having conversations just across the table is a fantastic way of doing it. Now, when I mentioned the Oxford Muse earlier, the Oxford Muse pioneered, certainly in Europe, the idea of a conversation meal, where strangers from across cities were invited in Oxford, in London, in Beijing, in Prague and other places. Strangers were invited to come to a meal where they would sit down opposite someone they didn't know. It could have been a CEO of a big company sitting down with a Tibetan monk or a former prostitute talking to an architect, anybody. And what we did at the Oxford Muse, and the Oxford Muse still does, is we put between them not a menu of food, but a menu of conversation. And on that menu of conversation were questions of for discussion, like, what have you learned about the different varieties of love in your life? Or in what ways would you like to be more courageous? Or how have your political ideals changed since you were a teenager? And the idea of these conversations was to try and is to try and allow people to make that empathic leap into another person's mind. It's something that I have been doing in community centers here in Britain. I've been doing in government departments, all sorts of places. And the organization I now do a lot of work with, the School of Life in London, also does these conversation meals. But another fantastic project I think we could learn from is something that started in Denmark. I don't know if you know about the human library.
No, I haven't heard
movement.
about that.
So it started in Denmark as a way of challenging prejudices that people had about refugees, people seeking asylum, people on the social margins. And the human library works like this. It's fantastic. It's now spread to over 20 countries. They've got it in Britain, across Europe, in Japan. What happens is your local library, your local town library, will have a special day, maybe one Saturday a month. And what you can do is you can go along to your library, and instead of borrowing books, you can actually borrow people. Now, those people are volunteers from various walks of life. It could be a bistro owner, it could be a nurse or a firefighter or an unemployed former drug addict. It could be anybody. And you, as a member of the public, can go and borrow them for an hour of conversation and see what happens by talking to people different from yourself. When you're finished, you put them back. Someone else can borrow them, and then you can shift and borrow another human being for a conversation. This human library idea is something that's incredibly easy to set up. It just requires a few volunteers to come once a month and have enjoyable conversations, which can, again, get you to step out of your own skin, to be like an actor who occupies the mind and the life of another person. That, I think, is how we're going to develop our capacities to be much more outrospective, to learn about life by stepping into the shoes of others rather than being introspective, which was the 20th century version of how to discover what to do with your life. I think we need to do the opposite. The human library is one way to do it.
Well, something I've noticed by looking at your website and talking to you, it seems that you kind of are focused with your definition of empathy on the imagination component of empathy. And so it kind of brings up for me, like, what are you seeing as the definition? Like, how are you defining empathy?
Well, as you know, when you pick up a psychology textbook, normally you'll find two different kinds of empathy defined there. The first one is what's called affective empathy, which is about mirroring somebody's emotions or sharing their emotions. So, for example, if I see anguish on my son's face and I too feel anguish, then that is affective empathy. That's sharing or mirroring somebody else's emotions. Now, if I see anguish on my son's face and I feel a different emotion, such as pity, I think, oh, poor child, poor little thing. That's not empathy, that's sympathy. That's an emotional response, which is different. So that you've got affective empathy on one side, that mirrored emotional response. On the other side, you've got in your psychology textbook what's called cognitive empathy or perspective-taking empathy. That is much more about the imaginative act of stepping into the shoes of another person and looking at the world through their eyes. It's about understanding their worldview, the beliefs, experiences, emotions that shape their view of life, how they see themselves, how they see the world. Now, in my own work on empathy, I've been much more focused on the cognitive side, that perspective-taking side, rather than the affective side. Now, both sides are absolutely intertwined, of course, because you need to step into someone else's shoes and see how they view life, and that experience can help create that emotional bond with another person. If you don't make that emotional bond, it can be a purely rational exercise where I understand how you view the world, but I develop no compassionate connection with you. We all know that psychopaths have that cognitive ability to look through somebody else's mind and mess with their heads. That's the sort of Hannibal Lecter kind of style of cognitive ability. But we also know that, of course, that emotional side is important too. But I think what's important to recognize is that the emotional, affective empathy abilities that we have and capacities are much more built into us, into our DNA. They're much more developed when we're children. And it's the cognitive ability is the one that we can develop much more as we grow older. Of course, children can develop cognitive empathy, but as adults, we can do that too. We can try and talk to our Afghani neighbor if we've never spoken to Afghani person before. We can have those conversations and experiences that Patricia Moore or George Orwell had. And so I focus a bit more on the cognitive side because I think that's the side that we can really ratchet up to create mass social change. And historically, that's the kind of empathy which has shifted history. It led to the great rise of a movement against slavery and the slave trade in the late 18th century, for instance. There was a cognitive shift of being able to understand what it was like to be a slave, get a bit of a taste of that, and that created a new social movement.
Well, something that I like to add to that definition is, I've been looking in a very eclectic manner at all the different definitions out there and been trying to synthesize it. So I've kind of broken it down to 4 parts. Kind of the first part being self-empathy, which is mindfulness, self-awareness, sensory awareness, like a self-knowledge of yourself. And the deeper you can have develop that quality, it seems that the deeper you can have the second level, which is the mirrored empathy or the affective empathy, which is based on the mirror neurons, being kind of mirroring through mirror neurons someone else. And then, as you were saying, the perspective taking or the kind of the imaginative empathy. And then there seems to be a fourth part, which is empathic action. That it's like, how do we work together in an empathic way? And I've heard one definition of that fourth part is that empathy is when the blocks to action are removed that don't exclude. So it's like I'm sure you've been in situations where you have to work with someone and there's like this conflict underneath and it's just not working. There's just something that's not working together. And that block is somehow that there's a lack of empathic connection. And that, and I've seen it as well in mediation. I don't know if you've been involved in mediation, but you'll have people who are disputants and they're kind of knocking heads and they're mad at each other. There's judgments. And you start empathizing with them. You turn the disputants to each other, encourage them to empathize with each other. They start understanding each other, and then they take the final step, which is they actually do something together. They put together sort of an action plan. And when this action is really smooth is usually when there's really good kind of empathy. So there's that empathic action. So just wondering how that kind of resonates with your understanding.
I think that's a fabulous way of thinking about different aspects of empathy and the process of what really happens. Excuse me.
I have a cough too. So.
On that first one about self-empathy, now that's a very important idea, and I think it really goes back to the ancient Greeks, and particularly to Aristotle. Now, Aristotle wrote that all man's feelings, all friendly feelings for others are an extension of a man's feelings for himself. He wrote that in his book, The Nicomachean Ethics. And what he meant there was that we need to feel good about ourselves, feel confident in ourselves, if we are going to expand our compassion towards others. If we don't know what makes ourselves happy, then how can we do it for somebody else? And I certainly agree that a certain kind of self-empathy, if you might want to call it that, I wouldn't necessarily call it that. I would actually call it a kind of a positive kind of self-love, a virtuous kind of self-love, is the beginning of developing an empathic imagination. As you say, that might then move on to developing affective empathy, that mirroring kind, the perspective-taking kind, and then, as you say, action. Now, in sort of strict definitional terms, I tend not to put the action as part of a definition of empathy. I know some people do, like yourself. Mary Gordon, the founder of the Roots of Empathy education program in Canada, also includes action as part of the definition of empathy. I don't include it in the definition itself in my own sort of more conceptual and theoretical writings on this. But of course, ultimately what matters to me, and I think to society, is that these empathic experiences get us to do something new. And a lot of my own work has been about trying to make that final shift into action. What can we do to do it? That's why I've been developing ideas such as founding the world's first empathy museum in order to really spur social action around empathy. And that's why I've worked with Oxfam and other organizations working in developing countries, for example, to try and get people to shift what they actually do, to change their actions. It's very easy to have a conversation with someone sleeping on the streets under a bridge and talk to them, have that empathic conversation where you understand a bit of what their life is like, but then to go on with your life afterwards. We need to keep empathically engaged, I think, if we're going to make that leap. And we need to, if we're going to make that leap to action, we need to be doing this with other people. We need to think about empathy as something that doesn't just happen between you and me as individuals, but something that can be a force for collective change. I think that's what's missing from most of the psychology writing and the neuroscience writing about empathy, the idea that empathy is the basis of mass social movement. But of course, I know there's something that you've been interested in yourself, the sort of the political ramifications of empathy as a force for action.
Well, that's what I've kind of honed it down. The message is that we need a culture of empathy. So we need to actually change society and raise the value of empathy and say, hey, this is really empathy is a foundational value in society, and we have to do everything we can to nurture it and foster it, and be very conscious about it and actually create a movement behind that. And it sounds like that's something that you're working on as well.
Yes, and the reason I'm working on it, for example, by wanting to found an empathy museum and starting to work to put that together, the museum, by the way, is a place where members of the public would go to have empathic experiences and conversations. I don't mean a museum in that dusty old sense of items behind glass cases. I mean a museum where you would walk in, for example, and in the first room there would be a human library like the one I was telling you about, with there would be people you could borrow and you would have conversations with strangers for a morning. In the next room you would walk in, it could be a room about climate change and global warming. That could go from a simple kind of exhibit where you would maybe lie in a darkened room and listen to the stories of people who are being impacted on by climate change today in India, for example, with rising flood waters and being hit by uncertain weather events, them talking about the impact of climate change on their lives. It could be school kids talking about their futures and how their future would like to be, because the problem with climate change is that we are failing to step into the shoes of future generations. There's an empathic gap there. All sorts of things could happen in this empathy museum. But one of the reasons I'm so interested in empathy as a force for social change is because I think there is extraordinary historical evidence that empathy can shift societies. The way we normally think about history is we think of the history of the rise and fall of governments or religions or empires or civilizations. I see history differently. I see history through the lens of the rise and fall of empathy, through the flowering of mass empathy and through its collapse, coming and going through time. And one of the instances which I think is most historically important, one I just briefly mentioned earlier, which is the rise of the anti-slavery movement in Britain in the late 18th century. Perhaps I could say a few words about that.
Absolutely, sure.
Well, there's a fantastic book written by the American historian Adam Hochschild called Bury the Chains. And I found this book hugely inspiring because it made me realize that empathy could shift human civilization. And what Hochschild says is this, is that in the late 18th century, and I'm talking about in Britain here, this also expands to the US, but particularly in Britain, the institution of slavery was absolutely socially accepted. There were 500,000 slaves being worked to death on sugar plantations in the Caribbean. People in Britain believed that the slave economy was necessary to economic growth, just like we believe the oil economy is necessary to economic growth today. And nobody was really challenging the institution of slavery. But then a group of radical Quakers and an Anglican deacon known as Thomas Clarkson started up a movement to challenge slavery. Now, this would have seemed impossible at the time because slavery was so deeply entrenched, had been for hundreds of years in Western culture and British culture. But they did something amazing. They shifted public opinion. And the way they did that was by getting the British public to understand something of what it was like to be a slave. And for example, they published a famous poster of hundreds and hundreds of slaves on a slave ship. It showed how there were about 500 slaves were all squeezed in next to each other in incredibly inhumane conditions. They printed 10,000 copies of these, of this poster, enormous publicity campaign for the time. And this poster found its way into pubs and cafes and homes and churches across the country. They also interviewed former slaves and wrote a report about their maltreatment and wrote articles in the press. Thomas Clarkson and the Quakers went around giving public talks showing the instruments of torture that were used on slave plantations, and former slaves themselves went and gave talks. What happened was a shift of empathic consciousness that, and this is in the late 1780s, early 1790s, suddenly British people could understand that sugar that they put in their tea was actually the product of an incredibly immoral process. And what happened was that hundreds of thousands of people signed petitions and rose up in social action, went into town hall meetings and called for an end to the slave trade and slavery itself. And eventually that happened. It took 10, 20, 30 years for it finally to work its way through. But this was the world's first great human rights movement and the world's first great empathic movement. And we have an enormous amount to learn from this struggle against slavery to apply to our own social struggles today, whether it's the struggle for health reform in the United States, whether it's the struggle on climate change around the world, whether it's a struggle for peace in the Middle East. We can go back to examples like the anti-slavery movement and find inspiration.
Well, it seems to me that the foundation of all the major social movements like that, the movement to end slavery, the movement for the right for women to vote, the civil rights movement, that at their core, all it is the value of empathy. It's like putting yourself into the shoes of the slave, into the shoes of women, into the shoes of African Americans in the South or wherever that couldn't vote. And each of these movements tend to be like pushing for more rights. And I've been thinking that if the movement had been pushing for more empathy, that, I mean, in a very conscious way, it's like, let's push for more empathy, that all the movements could have very much helped each other in that sense. So that there's this conscious push for a culture of empathy, so that now it's rights for gays and lesbians, for example, which is again a question of empathy. It's putting yourself into the shoes of gays and lesbians who have who feel bullied or suppressed through society. Don't have rights in hospitals. To see their partners and all kinds of issues like that.
Yeah, I think that your historical point is very important. I think there is a close association between the advance of human rights in their various forms, whether it's rights around sexuality or women's votes or slavery, a very close association between the rise of rights and the expansion of empathy. These things, I think, go hand in hand. It's not something that very many historians have really focused on yet, and I hope to write a book. In fact, one of my next books will be on the role that empathy has been played in developing and shifting human rights. I mean, some people have started thinking about this, I think, in quite a serious way. The moral philosopher Peter Singer has talked about it. Jeremy Rifkin has written about it a little bit in his book, The Empathic Civilization. I think it's still pretty much virgin territory. But I think the evidence is out there that these two things can go together. I agree with you also that, in a way, we need to have a two-pronged approach on a lot of these social issues. We need to consciously and directly campaign on, say, welfare reform or health reform. But equally, we need to create, as you say, a culture of empathy. And I love the way that you have made this phrase, a culture of empathy, one which has a kind of a global resonance. I mean, the way you talk about it is very well known now here in Britain as well. And I think the way to do that is by directly be talking about exactly why we need a culture of empathy, and through teaching it and making it part of, for example, the education system. I've been working for several years now to try and push the British government to improve the quality of its empathy teaching. It does it at the moment in quite in a relatively unsophisticated way. So school kids, for example, will have an empathy component to something that's called social and emotional aspects of learning. It's a part of the curriculum. It's not taken as seriously as it should be, and the kids do role plays. They read stories about bullying in the school playground, and that is part of trying to develop their empathic capacities. But I think we need to be doing what Mary Gordon and the Roots of Empathy program in Canada are doing, which is by adopting that program they have there. And as you know, over 500,000 Canadian school kids have gone through the Roots of Empathy program, which is about a very radical form of teaching in which the teacher of empathy, as you know, I think, Edwin, is a baby. That a baby is brought into the classroom, and that the school kids, normally between the ages of 5 and 12, adopt the baby for the year. The baby comes and visits them with the parent and the Roots of Empathy instructor every few weeks, and they sit and talk about the baby. They talk about, why is this baby crying, or why is this baby laughing? They try to understand the world through the baby's eyes, and through that they then do role plays and storytelling, trying to understand the world through each other's eyes, as the eyes of the other school kids, how their parents see them and they see their parents. And as you probably know, this program has been extraordinarily important in raising empathic awareness, through reducing bullying and bad behavior, and through improving academic attainment overall. It shows that empathy works on all levels. But what it shows is that, I think, in congruence with what you're saying, Edwin, which is that we need to talk directly about empathy, because the future social movements will arise out of this kind of empathy teaching, through explicitly trying to expand empathic consciousness, whether it is in a school through the Roots of Empathy project, whether it's through an empathy museum, whether it's through those conversation projects, which both of us are interested in. I think there's a huge potential here to put empathy right at the forefront of movements for social change.
Well, one movement is just getting launched is through the organization Ashoka, which does social entrepreneurship. And Mary Gordon is a fellow within that organization, and they're launching what they call a 5-year program to bring empathy education into all schools in North America and eventually the world. And they've just launched a website, empathy.ashoka.org, and they're wanting to make empathy a foundational value, just like math, science, English, empathy. So, from kindergarten through 12th grade, there would be empathy training, through the full curriculum as a separate subject.
Yeah, I think Ashoka has been pioneering in bringing empathy to the forefront, particularly the head of Ashoka, Bill Drayton, who I think has been a kind of a visionary in a way, through bringing on board people like Mary Gordon, getting behind the Roots of Empathy, and now their new initiatives to try and bring empathy teaching into the mainstream. And it's something I've been interested in for some years. I've done a bit of work, for example, with the New Economics Foundation in Britain to argue that empathy studies should be a college degree and it should be a separate school subject for in high school. Another project I'm planning to do is to set up an empathy school, a small school that sort of primary or elementary school kids can go to, which will begin as a sort of a weekend school, just like different religions have their weekend schools, whether you're Jewish or a Muslim. You can go along to a religious school. Equally, you should be able to go to an empathy school on the weekends where you learn about all the different aspects of empathy through the lens of psychology and history and art and music, everything. So I'm totally behind everything that Ashoka is doing. And let's hope that their great influence can spread more broadly, not just to North America, but to elsewhere as well.
Well, you started addressing the next question I had for you. What is your future work around empathy?
Yes, the main major project next is that I think I've got two projects. I'm just starting on a new book about empathy. It's called Outrospection, The 8 Habits of Highly Empathic People. And that's going to be what I hope will be a new kind of self-help book in a way, by trying to show how if we want to discover what to do with our lives rather than looking inside ourselves, we need to step outside ourselves. There's a great book, or a famous book, let's say, called the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People by Stephen Covey, which is a book mostly about personal success. And I want to do something slightly different from that and say, well, in the 21st century, we need not the 7 habits of highly successful people, but the 8 habits of highly empathic people. That's one project I'm doing, a kind of a writing project. But in parallel to that, I'm going to be developing the Empathy Museum project, which I mentioned earlier. And just as every major city in the world now has a Holocaust museum, I believe every city in the world should now have an empathy museum as well, a public space that can expand the compassionate imagination. I've been talking about this project with people like Patricia Moore, the designer who I mentioned earlier, with the British ecological artist Claire Patey, and many others, trying to, in a way, build up a consortium of people to start the Empathy Museum and, in a way, roadshow it as a new way of creating a new kind of public space.
Well, one thing I didn't get to as much as I'd wanted to is about your book, The Wonder Box. Can you give a short overview of the book and maybe give a bit of an outline of what you cover? You said you had a chapter there on empathy, and I was wondering what you cover in that chapter.
Well, there's a wonderful quote from the German writer Goethe. He said that he who cannot draw on 3,000 years is living from hand to mouth. And I took that idea as my leading thought in writing The Wonder Box, which is about what history can teach us about the art of living. What can the Renaissance teach us about finding a job you love? What can the ancient Greeks teach us about relationships and different varieties of love? What can we learn from Japanese pilgrims from the 18th century about the art of travel? But equally, what can we learn from the past about empathy? And in the chapter on empathy in The Wonder Box, I focus firstly on the story of St. Francis of Assisi, who in 1206, he was the son of a merchant, a wealthy merchant in the north of Italy. And early in the 13th century, he visited the Basilica of St. Peter's in Rome, and he was rather disgusted by the opulence and the luxury of the mosaics and the fine gold and silver. And when he walked out of the cathedral, the basilica, he saw a beggar sitting at the door, and he asked the beggar to exchange clothes with him. And he spent the day begging for alms. Like George Orwell, it was experiential empathy. This is one of the things that shifted his imagination. So that's how the chapter on empathy starts. But then I go and tell, I think, one of the most inspiring stories in the history of US race relations, the story of Claiborne Paul Ellis. Perhaps I should tell you a little bit about him just for a minute or two. C.P. Ellis, Claiborne Paul Ellis, as he's otherwise known, was born in 1927 in the county of Durham in North Carolina. He's not very well known today, but he's one of the great figures of the modern history of empathy. He was from a poor white working class background. He worked as a mechanic. He worked in a garage. He could hardly make ends meet and support his family. Now, he started blaming his own troubles on African Americans, blaming it on black people. And just like his father before him, he joined the Ku Klux Klan. C.P. Ellis went on to become a leader of his local chapter of the Ku Klux Klan. He became the Exalted Cyclops. When Martin Luther King was assassinated, he celebrated with his friends. He was an all-and-out white supremacist. But then something extraordinary happened to him in 1971. He was invited to a community meeting in Durham, North Carolina, to tackle racial problems in schools. He was invited along because he was a leading figure in this sort of the race issues and race conflicts of the time. And at this meeting, something amazing happened, which was that he was asked to be the chair of the race committee and to jointly chair this committee with somebody who he hated with a purple passion, which was a black civil rights activist called Ann Atwater. And Ann Atwater and C.P. Ellis were forced to work together. Now, C.P. Ellis thought, no way can I work with Ann Atwater. I hate this woman. But after a few days, Ann Atwater and C.P. Ellis had gone around trying to recruit people onto their race committee. C.P. Ellis went to all his white KKK friends, and all of them said, well, how can you work with this black civil rights activist, Ann Atwater? You're selling out the white race. And then Ann Atwater went around all of her friends in the black community, community workers, and they all said, how can you work with this white supremacist C.P. Ellis? They didn't want to talk to her. After a few days, C.P. Ellis and Ann Atwater met up, and they shared this experience of having been rejected by their local communities. And then Ann Atwater said, and you know, my daughter came home from school yesterday, and she was being made fun of by the other kids because I was talking to you, a Klansman. And C.P. Ellis said, you know, the same thing happened to my son. He came home from school yesterday, and a white teacher was making fun of him because my son's white teacher said, you know, your dad is spending this time with Ann Atwater, this black community activist. How could he do that? And basically, Ann Atwater and C.P. Ellis realized that they held an enormous amount in common. They shared the oppression of poverty. And C.P. Ellis realized that he had a human bond with this Ann Atwater person, and it realized that made him explode his own prejudices in an enormous way. He realized that the African Americans that he saw on the streets of North Carolina in Durham were human beings just like him. And at the end of this 10-day meeting in 1971, he stood up in front of 1,000 people and tore up his Ku Klux Klan membership card in front of them with tears in his eyes. And he later became the leader of a union, a janitors union, because he later was a janitor that was 70% black. He became an important civil rights activist in his area. The story of C.P. Ellis, which I tell in the Wonder Box, is an inspiration, I feel, for challenging our prejudices, talking to strangers, showing us that we can change even our most fundamental assumptions and prejudices about others. By looking into these past examples like C.P. Ellis, we can change our own lives and find new inspiration.
Well, I think one way to do that is through storytelling, and I really enjoy your storytelling. And I think that's really, I've even heard that the Enlightenment might have been caused by books and novels, and that people are able to empathize with each other more through writing. And I think your storytelling really helps with developing empathy as well.
Well, I think we used to live in the age of the storyteller. Before the printing press in the 15th century, it was the bard or the storyteller who really expanded our minds and told us about new things. So I think there's a role for storytelling in the future of empathy. I'm glad you think I'm part of it, but maybe more people can be part of it too. By telling the stories of our own experiences, ultimately, our own adventures in life, and by sharing those with others, that I think is how we're going to create a revolution of human relationships. I believe that we don't need a revolution of new political institutions or new laws. We need that revolution of human relationships that can allow us to see the world through the eyes of strangers.
Well, the next step, one of those ways of building that culture of empathy that I'm working on is to hold an online conference on how can we build a culture of empathy and compassion. So I'm hoping that you'll join in on a panel or maybe a couple of panels or an ongoing series of panels. It'll be for a whole year. And I'm just starting by doing individual interviews, and our next step is doing panel discussions. And so we can keep this conversation going and bring other people into it.
Well, I'd be delighted to take part. It'd be fabulous.
Okay, we've been going for about an hour. That's we'll call it an end here. So thank you so much, Roman, for just taking part in this. And I'm really so glad to have had a chance to really talk to you personally now. So thank you very much. And I'll stop the recording right now.
See the world through other people's eyes. Now, empathy is a quality of character that can change the world.